panel here to tell us how to make your content captivate, how to make your content come to life, how to build a community, how to push forward with the vision you have for changing the world. So very excited. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then I'll dive in and ask them kind of more specific questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A with you all. I would really like to make it a conversation, so please feel free when we get to the Q&A, ask away. I'll do our just quick introduction here first. Right here to my left is Mr. Philip McKenzie. He is a global curator and influencer, and he is the co-host of a podcast called Two Dope Boys and a Podcast. So, great name. The name itself is captivating. And we just had him, so I run a TV network, as Clayton mentioned, called Bold. And we just had Philip as a guest on our talk show. And we're always looking for great guests to come on our Bold network. We're produced by Al Roker from the Today Show. His people have a separate production company, separate from his duties, but they've been instrumental in getting our show off the ground. And so we're always looking for really great startups to come on our talk show. And one thing I like to say about what we do, as Clayton said, we started in Harlem. I think of Bold as a media incubator for this incubator community of Silicon Harlem. So we've been very lucky to have Philip on our show. We'll let him tell us more about how to cut through the noise. Next, here is Nancy Tagg. She's a professor and program director for the Masters in Branding and Integrated Communications at the City College of New York.
Yes.
So a very expert, and I think you've got a slide that you'll throw up later.
I do, but I think we have it, but I don't know where it is. I'm thinking it's somehow caught in that machine here.
Okay, do we know?
Do we have Sarah here?
Technology. I could find her.
Okay, yeah, that would be great if we have her visual, but we'll keep going for now. And then Melonie Echevarria, did I say that accent right? She's manager of business development and public relations at Being Latino. So I think we've got a great range of perspectives. And I wanted to kick it off. Melonie, we'll start with you. A few questions for you. First of all, what are the biggest social media trends that we're seeing right now within the Latino media space, first of all? And then how does your team think about balancing the immigrant experience with the assimilation into the broader American culture? And then what advice do you have for people who are looking to connect with the Latino audience, maybe coming from the outside?
Yeah, absolutely. So as she mentioned, just to give you a little bit of background on what it is that we do so you can understand the perspective that I'm coming from. Being Latino is a social media marketing agency, and essentially what we do is we work with brands to create content that is branded for them. So a lot of what we do is making sure that content includes the brand in a way that is seamless, in a way that connects with the culture and connects with the consumer in a very personal way. So that's just a little bit of what we do. We have our own internally owned and operated networks that we manage as well, so that gives us an additional perspective on how to create content that is effective. So in terms of trends that we've seen within the Latino community recently, I would say in terms of the kinds of content trends, I would say that video is definitely king right now. Video content is doing really, really well on social media, and we're also seeing a lot of Facebook Live. I have also noticed that a lot of creators have transitioned from that short, we went from 6-second video on Vine to 15 seconds on Instagram, to then Instagram then transitioned to 1-minute videos, and now Facebook is really pushing the needle and just moving us into longer form content. And by longer form content, I would say that means probably in the range of like 2 to 7 minutes. So we're seeing people transition more to longer form content increasingly within the recent months. In terms of the kinds of content and the kinds of topics that are being covered within the Latino community recently, we have definitely seen a surge in the past year, especially when it comes to politically driven topics, whether it's something about Trump or DACA or anything in between. Those kinds of content tend to do really, really well on our page, and I've noticed that influencers and different people within the community that have a really large following have increasingly been speaking on those topics. They've been increasingly speaking on those topics, even if it's something that they weren't necessarily doing in past years. So that's definitely something that we've noticed a surge in terms of content. The next question was the balance between immigrant assimilation, and just maintaining your cultural identity, correct? Make sure I wasn't skipping anything. So as far as it goes for us as a company, everyone there has their own experience. Some of us were born and raised here, and our parents came from other countries, and our culture comes from what we've experienced with our parents. For some people, it's that they were born and raised in another country and then came here, so that's a different experience. I think all in all, what we look to do, whether it's branded content or content that we put out in general, is to find a way to fuse the two together. So just to give you an example of what that means to fuse the two together, Being Latino recently did a cooking video, and this cooking video was about how to make Dorito nachos. And it was nachos with Doritos, and that's the perfect blend of your American snack and your Latino snack. And that video actually went up yesterday, and last time I checked it, it had over 600,000 views. So it did really well on the page, and people wanted to make it and things like that, so it got people excited. On a larger scale, I would say another good example is recently within pop culture. There is a Cuban-American singer. Her name is Camila Cabello, and she's in the general market. Her music is in English. She sings in pop. She used to be a part of Fifth Harmony, which is a group that came out of X Factor, which is a show. So her music video, which came out earlier this week, actually included 2 major U.S. Hispanic influencers. And they did a skit within the music video with the girl where they were basically acting out a very traditional Latino moment where the grandmother is at home and she's telling the older sister to take her out and hang out with her, and just a back and forth that is very true to U.S. Hispanic culture. And it was done in Spanglish, and it had its subtitles, but it was something that many people could relate to just because you lived that experience. So, and then it went into her music video. And then we have other examples of music like Despacito that was #1 and broke charts and things like that of again, combining the two in a way that is really seamless. So, that's kind of our take in terms of being able to find that balance, is being able to fuse the two cultures together in a way that is relatable to the overall experience. And then the final question was on just overall advice in terms of...
Yeah, reaching the Latino community from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that if you have a brand or a company or anything that you're just trying to develop and you're trying to connect with the Latino community, and this is something that I've actually been asked on a few other panels, my #1 answer is always, always, always to definitely consult with someone who is within the community. Whether it's a friend or someone that you work with, I would say always have someone at the table, because living that experience is something that really can't be matched. But if you're looking for where to start, the main thing in being able to connect with Latinos online would be to touch on our passion points. And at the end of the day, the content that does the best is the content that resonates with the consumer on a personal level. That they can look at it and say, I experienced this, this is relatable, this is emotionally stimulating, whatever it may be. Some of the key passion points and the key ways to reach Latinos and things that really make us tick and what we've seen on our end are food, family, sports, and music. Those are probably the key players in being able to connect with us in a relatable and unique way. At the end of the day, the whole point of creating content is always to be able to get people to kind of resonate with you, and if it's a brand, you want people to be able to see themselves with that brand. So speaking to their experience is something that I think is huge. So definitely speak to the passion points and make sure that you always consult with someone who has lived the experience, because they'll be able to tell you, how you can improve, make it better, and give you suggestions.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very helpful, Melonie.
Thank you.
And now I have the song Despacito in my head. We'll dance after. So Nancy, tell us, so you're a professor. Do we have your slide, by the way, Dick Clayton?
I don't think we have the
Do we have the
slide.
slide or no?
Not yet.
Okay.
Do we have the slide?
Yeah, we should have.
We do?
Yes.
Go to Philip then.
Okay. All right. We're going to Philip, and then once we get the
As long as
famous
there's a
slide
camera, we
up.
have it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. We'll do Philip for now.
I'm going to try to be as interesting as the slide.
Because otherwise I'd have to go do a lot of this, and I think the graphic would be better.
All right. So Philip, with your podcast and all your other digital experience, tell us, how do you stand out and cut through the noise? Because there is a lot of noise. The barrier to entry is pretty much zero these days to start creating content. And then how do you monetize a podcast? Because I would imagine the same skills are applicable even if you're not doing a podcast, but the digital space in general. But how are you monetizing? And then how did you transition from a big company? You were in corporate America. We were talking earlier. We both worked at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
How did you transition from that stable, nice paycheck to crazy town startup?
Okay. Well, I'll actually take them in order. And obviously, all of you guys are aware that there is absolutely a ton of content out there, no matter how we're choosing to define that, whether it's old media, what's considered old media, over-the-top television or books or music, and the many different ways you can capture that. There's podcasts, there's movies. All of us are suffering from what could be called an attention deficit, right? Like you're being constantly pulled in all these different directions. So I think if you're going to be a creator, you have to understand what's the most effective way to craft your message. Is there an audience for your message? These are all the questions you should be asking yourself if you're going to put yourself out there to make something. Are you going to add to the noise? Are you going to be something that's valuable? It's really difficult to break through, and I think that low barrier to entry that you refer to comes through technology. The cost is almost zero. To anyone can pick up their phone, talk into it, and post that video anywhere, and that's under the illusion that is content, and that might be content to maybe your friends or your family and those who follow you, to use those kind of words. But in order to really have impact, it's a machine that is very much part of the old machine. So as much as there is all these new tools that allow us to get out there, you still have to use many of the old tried and true methods in order to make that message go from sort of a small chamber into a bigger world, assuming that that's what your goal is. Some people have the goal to just put something out there and create for creation's sake. They don't have the goals like a corporate partner, like a Coca-Cola or a Microsoft or a Dell. They have clearly different goals. So if I use myself, for example, with the podcast, yes, it would be amazing if our show was as big as Tim Ferriss, for example, or Mark Maron. But really, for myself and Michael to be effective in a lot of other things that we do, we consult both together and separately. We do a lot of strategy work for brands. I always jokingly say our audience is really 1,000 people. It's 500 CMOs and chief innovation officers. If I get 50 of those people to hire me, I don't really care if 50,000 miscellaneous people listen to the show. So I'm happy if they do, but that's not really why we created the show. We created the show because we were friends and we had a particular perspective that we thought was a valuable one. And so as we sat at my kitchen table often and polished off a bottle or two, in the midst of a lot of our bullshit became, wow, there's something valuable here given my experience in branding and corporate, like you said, Wall Street, and his experience as a political analyst and a content creator, because he's exists on other shows beyond our show. And we kind of put those two animals together and figured, this could be a great way for us to get our name out there among a very particular audience and then upsell many other services. Like I said, we do strategy work and consulting work. So a big part of cutting through that noise is really understanding who your audience is, the purpose of why you're creating in the first place, and then how you're going to put all of that together in order to achieve a goal that you should have already had in mind before you created whatever it is that you're creating. When it comes to monetizing, again, if you're going to use a podcast as an example, so I'll just continue with that example. You know, it's really the largest podcasts that get the lion's share of traditional ad space. So the podcast pool is like, the numbers are a little off, but it's like $240 million just this past year that went specifically toward podcast advertising. And that number is growing year over year. So it's one of the fastest growing segments for a lot of reasons that I'm happy to go into if people have follow-up questions. But if you look at where that pool is going, it's going primarily to the shows that are either part of established podcast channels or that have really, really big followings, you know, upwards to 1 million, 2 million downloads. And the number of shows that have that and that you can really capture that scale are actually very small. So if you're just gonna put out a podcast, you have to ask yourself, you know, is it likely that I'm gonna get to the point where I have like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million type of subscribers, and I'm doing that per episode, not over like the course of a series or a season or something like that. So if you're not going to be in that category, you have to decide, okay, I'm going to go out on my own or maybe create a small Salesforce team and sell my own ads and sell my own show. And from that perspective, podcasting is very much the wild, wild west. It's very hard for people to figure out, you know, when you're talking to brands, they're kind of clueless, which you can use to your advantage. So if you walk in the door and you have a really compelling story, you can make the argument that your show matches either their brand or the audience you reach fits with what they're looking for. You can make a sale and sell your show that way. Or you can go another route. When we were out in the hallway, some guys mentioned Patreon. You can do the Patreon method, which is a way where you create a Patreon channel and people pay to subscribe to your content. And that's not only for podcasts, it's for writing or music or illustrating or movies or anything like that. So you're making the decision that people are gonna pay, either you're gonna have institutional players, so brands or agencies that are gonna pay you to be a part of your show, or you're gonna get individuals. You know, so maybe those 10,000 people that really love your show will say, hey, here's $5 or $10. Usually patrons have different levels. You know, there's quite a few shows that are very successful doing that, where they make 6 figures a month literally by managing their own Patreon accounts and other ways that people can subscribe. So that's 2 decision factors you have to think about when you're going to go down the monetization route. And then finally, when you asked me about making that transition from corporate into doing the things that I do now, whether it's the podcast or I produce a conference and I mentioned the strategy work as well, you know, that is a decision that anyone has to make on their own. Like transitioning from corporate to being an entrepreneur or starting your own business is not easy. I actually would make the argument, because I'm a little bit of a contrarian, that it was harder for me to walk into Goldman Sachs every day when I didn't like it than it is to do what I do now, even though what I do now is completely chaotic. Mm-hmm. In the sense that it's feast or famine. You know, you eat what you kill, even though I don't like the war kind of references, but you know, some months or weeks or periods of time, it's really, really good. You know, you're firing on all cylinders, people like what you're doing, you're being asked to do things where people are willing to pay you as opposed to being asked to do things for free, which you should never do, or very rarely do. That's another conversation if anyone wants to ask me about that.
Gotta get him hooked, I guess.
Yeah, gotta get them hooked. But that's the transition. The life of building something isn't for everybody. Though unfortunately, societal shifts are turning us more into having to find alternative ways to make a living. Whether you want to call that freelancing as it was back in the day, or now the gig economy is a very popular way to frame these things. But obviously there's a huge shift in just the way corporate works. And you have to understand that even from the perspective of if you have corporate clients, they don't pay you every 2 weeks. You do work for them, and then oftentimes you're waiting 30 days if you're lucky. Sometimes it's 60, 90 or more. So you have to factor that in. And if you're someone who's making things, like we have a studio, we have a producer, we have cost of people who we have to pay regardless of when we're getting paid. So these are all the little things or big things that one needs to factor into it. But it is a psychological thing. Do you want to wake up and walk into a place that you may or may not like, and doing work you may or may not love or agree with, or do you want to strike out on your own and chart a course that's going to take you in many different directions? Because when I left Goldman, I didn't know any of this existed, and some of it didn't exist. Like there were no podcasts back then, But all the things I've done since then, whether it's the conference or run a magazine or run a creative agency, I did not leave Goldman with the intention of doing those things. I left Goldman with the intention of just leaving, and then I'll figure it out later.
And you mentioned the word chaos. Someone said the phrase entrepreneur porn the other day, and I thought it was very interesting because I think sometimes there's this gloss, there's this Instagram polish that everyone sees the upside, everyone sees the it girl or the it boy, and everything's dandy, and that you have to keep this image up. Why do you think that's there? And can you talk about whether you think that's healthy or not?
It's not healthy, and so that's easy.
Yeah, who's guilty in this room of that, actually?
It's totally not healthy, and that's actually, and I'll keep this short because I know we have to move on. But I'm working on a book around some of those things. It's not a plug for the book because it's nowhere near done. Another thing that hangs over my head every day, as I work on a 1-page-a-day mantra. But regardless of that, social media and this idea of influence and sort of the entrepreneur porn, I guess if you want to call it, is terrible. I won't use the words I normally will use to describe it. The show is not as clean as I'm going to talk right now. All of that stuff is completely terrible and detrimental to all of your pursuits if you are pursuing being an entrepreneur. What it does is it encourages us to take these shortcuts. I grew up in New York all my life, from Brooklyn, and people have often heard this term, fake it till you make it, right? Like we've all heard this idea that, act as if, pretend you are whatever you want to be. And I think that was probably great advice back in the day, but now that we have this world that's splintering where there's more of us out here trying to build things, if I'm faking it all the time, no one knows when I need help. And we create this aura around ourselves where we're unwilling to or incapable of asking each other for help. So if you're seeing on my LinkedIn or my Facebook or whatever, oh, Phil just did this, Phil's speaking here, he did this, you're like, shit, well, shucks, this guy he's killing it, right? Like, everything's all good, so I don't gotta worry about him. And that's often not true. Like, I can't tell you the number of nights I wake up in cold sweats about how am I gonna get from point A to point B, and then I'm up wandering around my house drinking, so those are real things that people don't want to share because we're afraid of being open and having empathy to one another, and that prevents us from building like real coalition. So brands and corporate people, they use that to their advantage, right? So we're like serfs, they're the king in the kingdom. They sprinkle money out to all of us because we feel like we're all fighting among each other, right? Like, if I got to pitch business, I don't want to tell this other person, because what if they get the business and I don't? Rather than us thinking about strategically, like, I can't do everything, maybe you can't do everything. Maybe if you knew where I'm weak and you're strong, we could come together and do bigger projects. Maybe that $50,000 project we can upsell into like a $250,000 project because we're now bigger, you know? And so we got to get past that being divisive and keeping things to ourselves. We got to open up and take risks, and our biggest risks are usually personal risks.
Awesome. That's amazing. Thank you, Phil. And then my personal drug of choice is Reese's peanut butter cups at 3 a.m. in the morning, personally.
Mine's
Everyone's got
bourbon.
their own.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Maker's Mark, if you have. If anybody wants to send gifts to the studio, Maker's.
Yeah. All right, Nancy. Now, do we have this
Do we have
alleged
it or no?
slide?
No? Yes. I'll dance. We don't have a slide, I'll dance.
Yes. Despacito.
You're right.
So just while that's getting queued up, the questions that I think would be interesting for this audience, given we are on a campus right now,
Yes.
what are the most common mistakes you're seeing right now among students?
Mm-hmm.
And then what books do you recommend, or overall reading do you recommend, maybe if you're not enrolled in a formal school right now, just to get a big picture of what's happening with the industry and marketing and social media? And then third of all, I realize you're an interested party because you're a professor, but is graduate school worth it? I mean, what's your take on a lot of these open source courses, massive online open courses, coding boot camps? Are those going to supplant the master's program, or maybe even the bachelor's program? And I say this as someone who has a master's. I try to live with no regret, but every now and then I'm just like, there's an opportunity cost for everything.
Yeah,
So-
no, absolutely. The colorful one. Give me the colorful one. Thank you. So I'm the director of a master's program in branding and integrated communications up at City College. And it is a fairly new program. We launched in 2013, and we launched specifically because the communications landscape is so crazy right now. Communications is so distinctively different today in 2010 to where we are now than it had been, that we felt that we needed to actually create a program specifically to address that. So I can probably loop back to the end of your, to the third question. Communications is more powerful than it's ever been. It is more dynamic. It is more complicated. It is more significant than ever before. And so I wanted to bring up the reason why I was so eager to have this slide, and I almost didn't want to start talking without it, because as you can see, I could dance to this. This is 2015, which is not even now, and you can see the explosion of opportunities that we have, communication platforms. And it's pretty insane when you look at it, but this chart makes it actually look kind of colorful, and there are everything's in a circle, so there are things that are discrete. But I think it dramatizes how many opportunities and how confusing it can be. In fact, Melonie, when you were talking about all the programs and communications and the content that you're dealing with, I'm so exhausted just listening to you. It's like so amazing. And so this kind of discrete chart, I think, helps to kind of calm us down a little bit. And I'm looking at the crowd here today, and I see that the spectrum of ages is really pretty broad, which is awesome. And so I don't think that anyone here in the room is young enough to not remember how communications used to be before 2015, or a little bit before 2000, let's say. And that's a kind of a fuzzy number. So before 2000, I think we all can remember that communications had very few opportunities to be a platform for content and to create. We had printed matter in the form of newspapers, magazines, billboards. We had time-based media, we had radio, we had TV. TV was really exciting when it came along, and it was considered radio with pictures. which tells you something about how long it takes us to understand the power of any particular medium. So from 1950 to about 2005, so over 50 years, year after year, decade after decade, we really had only a few forms of communications in which we could communicate to the masses. And we were happy with that. It's not like we felt, oh, you know, what's missing? We were happy with it because it's what we had, and it evolved. It's not that it didn't evolve, but we got very used to it. And it took a long time for us to figure out the power of each one of those mediums. This is 2015, and it is seriously, almost literally, a blink of the eye. So when you think of 50 years of mediums in those limited formats, and then suddenly you see this amazing explosion. This is something that, to your question about students getting it wrong and why we launched the program, everybody was getting it wrong. Everybody continues to get it wrong. So if you're an influencer, if you have an enterprise, if you have, or you're creating content for somebody else, for a client, you have so many options, and the ability to understand how those all work, it's all very new. And so it's become even more complicated in 2017. If I could, I have a series of graphics that go from manageable to kind of scary to, oh my God, I just want to go under my bed and hide, because all of these are discrete, right? So you have Facebook, which is a social networking platform, and more visual ones like Pinterest and Instagram, and each one of those had their own ways of communicating. And we don't even understand the power of those forms of communications yet. I mean, we're just kind of learning and understanding them. So every one of you have options and opportunities to use Facebook or to use Instagram. But we're still trying to figure out what its power is, and it's evolving, right? And that's just one little circle. And so you were talking about all these other little circles. You have video, and whereas before you were talking to Philip, is that if you wanted to do video 20 years ago, you had to have a big production crew, you had to have a lot of money. You don't need that anymore. So understanding how video works now is no longer that nice discrete bubble that you see up here. It's really challenging to even understand it. Augmented reality, virtual reality, podcast, it's just an absolute explosion. And so the industry, people who have lots of money and expertise and MBAs and all kinds of degrees, are struggling to figure out what this landscape is all about. Entrepreneurs have all these opportunities, so you could look at this and see that it's completely frightening, but you could also appreciate it as an explosion of opportunities. And so for students as well, looking at this and trying to figure out what matters. The added challenge is today that it's not just these discrete bubbles, but now the bubbles are talking to each other as well through algorithms and social media, and we don't have storytelling anymore. We have story building, where people come into the story and try to not purposely necessarily hijack it. So you have to have really strong identity and a point of view. So for the students, to get them, I think the challenge for students and what they do wrong, but what we all do wrong, both on a high scale and a lower scale, is we chase after the shiny object. And what's the newest thing? Or what, as consumers, we're most excited about, which is one great way to get into this, because we're all so much earlier adopters now because things move so quickly. So we're all exposed to this. I think what the value of our program is that we ask students to step back from what is a seduction and a lot of value and opportunity, but to step back and do the B part of our branding and integrated communications program, which is to think strategically. But first, before we think strategically, is to try to figure out who we are and what our value is, the why. Why are we doing anything? And that's the branding part of it. So for a large corporation, from McDonald's to Starbucks, thinking about brand seems to be a luxury. But for everybody, whether you are doing this on your own, whether you're an entrepreneur, or whether you're doing it for a large corporation, is to think about the why you're doing something, who you are, and what value that message has to your audience, but also to society. And I think in that way, when you start to communicate it, you actually have some identity. And to the question you asked about the noise, is that then you're speaking with more clarity, with more consistency, and you'll be able to make an impact, and hopefully not just to your audience, but maybe if you're lucky, and hopefully if we think about ourselves this way, we make an impact on society.
Great. Thank you so much.
Can I add to the textbook thing?
Oh yeah, it reads.
To the textbook thing, to reading. So it's so we don't use a lot of textbooks. We have, most of our faculty are active professionals, and so we consider them walking textbooks. So I would encourage people to do, if you don't go into a program where you're actively seeing what we call BIC like a TED Talk. Every night there's people coming in and talking. You should go to conferences. You're doing exactly the right thing. You go to conferences, you listen to people, you make those connections. So rather than read textbooks, which can be antiquated very, very quickly these days, inspirational books, I love Contagious, Jonah Berger. I still love Made to Stick by the Heath brothers. There's still some classics that I rely on, especially when it's late at night and I don't have bourbon. But also, I think, curators. So you find people that you're interested in and you follow them and let them do some of the work for you.
Who do you follow?
I follow, well, two of the things that I tend to do, I love to go to, my one go-to podcast is Pod Save America, which I don't do for communications purposes, other than as a student of communication, and I listen to how good they are at communicating. I do a lot of research. I do the Advertising Research Foundation, because I think if you're trying to find trends, you want to go to the source. So go really deep into data and the kind of the raw stuff that you might not think is going to yield anything. I think that's a great place to kind of get used to seeing all kinds of information, and then go to the people that process it for you. So curators. I love PSFK, which is a communications and technology space about insights and trends. So I try to go to people who've already processed it, and then I also try to go a little bit more source material so that I can start seeing what inspires me and try to build insights myself.
Great. Excellent, thank you. All right, well, we're gonna open up to questions. We just got time for a few questions, so any takers? Yes, back there? You in the red tie. Yes, you.
I have a question for Melonie. It's a two-part question. Have you ever had a tough time promoting content you may not relate to the Latino community? And second, for how long have you been helping create content that can help relate to the Latino community? Like how long? Like 5 years, 10 years?
So, as far as the first question in terms of having trouble creating content to connect, that was your question, right?
Yes.
I can't say that I've personally had trouble. I think that a lot of my clients have had trouble in understanding why whatever we're creating does connect. The reason I say that I haven't experienced trouble just because us at our company, we tend to just play off of our daily lives and what we've experienced. But if the client doesn't have that experience, a lot of times they don't understand why a flying slipper is funny for Latinos, and it makes sense for their some people get it, but sometimes they don't understand. So I think that's been probably one of our biggest struggles in being able to help people understand. But at that point, then it's our job to help them in the sense of just giving them an example. This is what happens when most Latinos experience X, Y, and Z, and just explain what the situation is in a home setting so that they can understand. And we've been successful in being able to turn things around where sometimes clients, they'll start off and say, well, I don't understand this isn't really funny to me, to once we give them the context of why it makes sense in real life and how we experience it, they'll say, got it, that makes sense, I love connecting my brand in that way, and we've seen successful results with it. As in terms of how long I've been doing it, I've been with the company for 4 years now. The company has been around since 2009, but it evolved with the space. So in 2009 when it started, it was just a Facebook page that posted relatable content. From there, it was blog posts that were really popular, and that's what was being created. And after that, it became photo posts and then ultimately video. So, yeah.
Evolution, like everything else.
Yes, absolutely.
When you were talking, it reminded me of what happened recently with the Dove commercial campaign.
Yeah.
Although it was offending, an African American audience, but Dove just preemptively, maybe you can go help them before they make the awful Latino ad.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know who they were talking to.
It happens, and we've seen so many examples, especially recently, of just things like that. Unfortunately, even Pepsi had a slip up recently with their Kendall Jenner commercial. So it does happen, and I think that it speaks again to just having someone at the table who has lived the experience, and who really understands the culture in a personal way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, so this is me?
Yeah.
Okay. This question, although it's geared towards Melonie, I believe I want to per se answer it. You mentioned initially that we're moving from short, like term content to like video content. So you have things like Facebook Live as opposed to Snapchat or Instagram, you name it. And I'm just wondering, like, more so, how do you appeal to like the millennial short attention span, right? Because I was into a podcast and read a book at the same time, right? And I'm sure I'm not the only person who does that. So I'm wondering, like, how do you cut through that noise and still, like, get your message out there and have it lengthy content along with that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a question that's something that we discuss in the office almost every day. And I can tell you the number one thing that I think of when I'm watching any piece of content, whether we're producing it or it's produced by someone else, I'm like, okay, am I going to sit here and watch this past 10 seconds? Because I know personally, I'm the same way. I'll do 10 different things at once. I'll have the TV on, have the radio on, be on my phone all at once. So how do you cut through that noise? I think it goes back to what I said earlier, being relatable and resonating personally. Now, that being said, there's a really big emphasis on good content. The question is, what is good content? And that will depend on your audience. But when it comes to longer form content, what we notice is being able to capture people within those first 10 to 20 seconds is really important for retention. And the way that you do that is you put your gems of information. If it's comedy, you make sure that you have punchlines in the beginning. If it's something that is, for example, a recipe video, make sure that they know what they're going to see and it entices them to continue to watch to see how it's done. So that's kind of how we do it, but it's definitely an ongoing conversation. It is really tough with so much content being out there, and it's an evolution in and of itself.
I'll weigh in on that as well, because again, the contrarian hat, like we take a different approach when we're talking to institutions and they're trying to understand content. I probably think most organizations, so I'm thinking about like brands and marketers and other institutions, they actually don't, they think they know what they're talking about, but they really don't know what they're talking about. And a lot of this thing from a cultural perspective, it's like the trend or like the shiny thing becomes in a way like a loss leader. And like a couple of examples of that. Like I remember years ago, people were like, oh, young people aren't reading books anymore. Like books are dying, no one's reading print, and it's just going away. And then you have things like the Hunger Games and Harry Potter and stuff like that, and young kids who previously don't have the attention span to read are reading 600-700 page books. A show, shows like John Oliver, for example. People in video were like, oh, people don't want to watch a video longer than like a minute. Like I've literally sat in brand conversations where they're like, oh, this is a minute 30, like we can't do this, got to figure out a way to cut it down. And then John Oliver posts videos that are 25 minutes long and they have like 3 million, 4 million views and they're viral. I don't think it's the length or the medium, it's whether or not it sucks. If it's something that sucks, then people aren't going to watch it or read it or listen to it. I mean, I go to shows all the time and I see these bands that people talk about like, oh, they're Stereo Gum and Pitchfork, all these different sites, Pigeons and Planes, whatever. And there's like 1,000 people there or less. You know, and I'm like, it's really easy to do that, to get like your little core group. It's much harder to be like Coldplay, right? But all the cool people say Coldplay sucks, right? But I'm like, do they? Like, it's much harder to do that, right? To get 30 million people on the same page to say like, yo, I dig that song. Even though the cool kids are like, oh, they're terrible. So I think like, you gotta like look past some of that stuff and don't listen to these folks because they're idiots. So if it's good, people will read the 800-page book. Look at it. I bought that for my niece. She's 14. That book is over 1,000 pages. And she's going to read that whole thing. You know, even though she's Gen Z and they don't read or whatever. It's like, it's bullshit.
So don't suck. That's the
Yeah, don't don't suck.
So I think we're gonna leave right there, but please come mob our panelists. Thank you so much, Melonie, Philip, and Nancy. Please give them a round of applause. All right, now on to the sword.